Audiobook Always Visible, Another Prayer for the Dying Horror Genre, by Vitaly Ivolginsky. Based on the motion picture Omen IV, The Awakening. Third chapter. So when it came to food, Delia involuntarily thought that it would be great to visit, where she can surely eat her fill. The girl was impatiently waiting for Jaff to come up to the phone and tell him what choice of dishes he could offer his young guest. And intuition once again did not deceive Delia. The interlocutor's answer was exactly what she expected to hear. "You came to me just in time, Joe," a cheerful voice came from the phone. "I just have a lamb shoulder in the oven, turned it off now, and yesterday's beans with tomato paste on the stove." "That's absolutely awesome," Japhet, Joe and Delia both exclaimed simultaneously. It seemed that the interlocutor did not expect that someone else would intervene in a conversation with his friend, because a strange stifled sound immediately came from the phone, like Jaff suddenly choked on something. Jordan looked inquiringly at Delia, who smiled silently. Her eyes seemed to tell him big deal, couldn't contain excitement, and a Jussie Joe returned to the conversation. "How about desserts?" he asked with some tension in his voice. "Today I decided to do without any frills," said Jaff, "so no sweets and starchy foods, only meat and beans, and the tea of course." "All right, Jaff," with some annoyance answered a Jussie Joe. "Well, wait for us, Jaff, we will come to you soon." "We got a deal, bye," said Japhet at the end, and there was a click on the telephone receiver. "Imagine that," thought Delia, "after all, half an hour ago, I did not even think that I will go today to visit my neighbor's friend." Meanwhile, a Jussie Joe hung up the phone and rested his hands wearily on the table. After standing like that for a couple of seconds, he turned to the girl, and she saw what a happy and contented face he had. "So now, Delia," he said in a cheerful voice, stretching out to his full height, "go outside, and I'll wash myself." "Okay," baby girl agreed without question. She immediately rushed from her place to the exit, right on the go throwing her long hair out of her face. A Jussie Joe continued to stand at the table. "You can play with Buffalo, but just don't go far from the wicket," he shouted after her and slowly went to the bathroom. Delia no longer heard him, because she had already gone out into the yard, where the neighbor's dog was barking around the yard, happily wagging its tail. The next moment, she was already holding the dog by his fluffy ears, and he obediently poked his muzzle into her chest and squealed softly when the girl scratched him behind the ears. Then she got up from her knees and began to play catch-up with Buffalo, pretended to run away from him in fear while he scuttled around, trying to grab her by the hem of her skirt, which Delia, deftly dodging his jaws and, if necessary, inflicting weak but confident blows with her small foot on the black wet nose of the dog. Please, do not think that she was cruel. She just did not want to change her clothes often. So baby girl played with the dog for about 5 or 6 minutes, before Uncle Joe finally deigned to leave the bathroom and go out onto the porch. The dog, seeing his owner, immediately forgot about his little friend and immediately rushed towards Jordan, wanting to lick him in the face, but man pulled away from Buffalo and, trying not to pay attention to him, went to the wicket. "I am ready to go," shouting, he beckoned the girl to follow him. Delia did not have to be pulled. A Jussie Joe opened the gate and, letting his young companion in front, stepped after her. While he fiddled with the keys, the baby saw Buffalo lie down near the porch and put his big head on his paws, seeing people off with a sad look of his brown eyes. The girl took pity on him. After all, this creature really loved her and treated her with all the respect that a man's best friend is capable of. "Well, Delia, let's go." A Jussie Joe touched the girl's shoulder and immediately withdrew his hand. Delia turned to Jordan and looked at him carefully. During the time that he spent in the bath, he managed to wash his face and lightly style his hair, although in front and sides they continued to bristle in all directions. In this, the man also somewhat resembled a girl. She also constantly experienced problems with her hair, which no matter how hard she tried to style, but naughty curls constantly climbed into her face. Delia considered it beneath her dignity to agree to a short haircut, and her mother's suggestions to resort to hairspray she rejected with indignation, because she really didn't like the feeling of some sticky substance pulling her hair together. Did you miss my dog? Jordan asked, also looking the girl up and down. Delia shrugged her shoulders, cast a thoughtful glance at the tightly closed gate of his house, and, straightening her skirt, went ahead along the road, saying to her adult friend right on the go. Don't worry, Jessie Joe. Jordan joined her and they walked side by side. From the side it seemed as if it was a young father walking with a little daughter. This couple made such a sweet impression, and so naturally they stuck together. It was the end of September, the weather was warm and clear in Portland. Besides, outside the city, unlike the center, there was no stuffiness in the air. But Delia was not particularly interested in the scenery around, as is usually the case with children. She completely trusted her adult guide, and, relaxing, she walked unhurriedly beside Jordan, sometimes raising her eyes from the road for a moment to stare at the wall of the distant forest dimly visible in the distance and the people passing towards them. By the time they got to the only area in the suburbs built up with tall 5-story block buildings on the principle of typical housing construction, it's been a little less than an hour. An unjustified suspicion crept into Delia's head that they would never reach their destination, but Jessie Joe suddenly stopped, and turning to the girl, looked her straight in the eyes and clapped his hands. House number 154, 82nd apartment, he said with incredible energy. We arrived. With these words, Uncle Joe went to the battered doorbell phone and alternately pressed the keys 8, 8, and 2, 2, then the call button. For a while, some white noise was heard from the speaker, and then the girl heard a voice she already knew. Who's out there? Japhet asked in a questioning tone. Open it up, Dormouse, the bear has come, barely suppressing a laugh, exclaimed Jessie Joe. Maybe you a dormouse yourself, the voice grumbled indignantly. The girl heard a click from the doorbell phone speaker. This is Jaff hung up. A second later, an electrical signal was received on the lock of the entrance door, and it opened with a slight metallic clang. Jordan opened the door as wide as he could and nodded to Delia to go in first. Slightly taken aback, the girl walked past him and found herself in the poorly lit entrance of a multi-story building, the walls of which were covered with blue paint. The musty smell of dampness hung in the air, mixed with the chemical smell of bleach. Apparently, literally this morning at the entrance cleaning was done. For a while, Delia simply stood still, but when the light from the doorway suddenly disappeared, she turned back, stepping on the cement floor. Jessie Joe approached her, closing the door. Come up to the 4th floor, your legs will be faster than mine, he said softly. Delia, deciding what she heard, silently shrugged her shoulders in response. But as Jordan got closer, she understood why he chose to let her go ahead. When walking, his right leg dragged slightly on the floor. Baby girl involuntarily felt sorry for the man. Jessie Joe, why are you limping? She asked with some fear. Go forward, he said, waving his hand in her direction. I shall be with you. Delia had to submit. She turned and rushed up the stairs, her shoes clattering loudly on the steps, while Jordan slowly followed. The girl, going up the stairs, began to count to herself. Here is the first staircase, here is the second. When she finally ran up to the 4th floor, out of breath, she realized that she was completely exhausted. Panting, Delia stopped at the unsightly steel door and glanced up the stairs. Judging by the sound of footsteps, Jessie Joe had just begun to climb up to the 2nd floor. Suddenly she heard how on her left someone turns the key in the lock. She turned in that direction and saw a bright spot lying on the floor, coming from the open door, on the threshold of which stood a young man with curly blonde hair that reached his shoulders. The stranger's eyes sparkled from under the glasses. Noticing the girl standing on the landing, the man scratched his head with one hand, continuing to hold the other on the front door handle. You is new Joe's neighbor, isn't it? With noticeable weariness in his voice he asked and, without waiting for her answer, continued. I'm standing here in the hallway, waiting for both of you, because I already let you in the entrance. He apparently wanted to launch into a lengthy explanation about his experiences, but Delia interrupted him in mid-sentence, casually waving her hand. Let's get acquainted, with a secular tone said the girl. My name is Delia, just a little girl, who loves to read. And she did niction, causing her long hair to fall over her eyes. Straightening up, the girl straightened them and smiled coquettishly. The man, still holding the door, bit his lip and shrugged his shoulders. Delia felt that her feigned familiarity did not impress him properly, but that didn't bother her much, for what was the harm in it if this man, whom she scarcely knew, thought her a little frivolous? "Well, where is Joe?" apartment owner asked the girl. "I am already right there," Jordan's voice reached them. Jaff and Delia turned their eyes to the stairs. Jussie Joe was already walking down the corridor towards them, straightening the collar of his shirt as he went. For some reason, surrounded by walls painted with blue oil paint, his figure looked especially impressive. It seemed that this young man in a white shirt and velour trousers was a man who rotated in higher realms than all other people, such as Delia herself or her elderly father. Hippity hip hooray, for joy, the girl could hardly refrain from jump on the spot. Eventually Yuz appeared. "Jaff, let that kid into the apartment," as if ignoring her reaction, Jussie Joe turned to his friend. "It's all right," sighed Jaffet and removed his hand from the door. Delia went in first, then Jordan followed her, and Jaff hesitated a little to double locking the door. Baby girl took a few cautious steps along the shabby, but still strong linoleum, stopped at a large wardrobe and looked with curiosity at the decoration of the apartment, which she happened to visit for the first time in forever. What appeared before Delia's eyes left her with a rather pleasant impression. Jaffet had not bad taste. The walls of his apartment were covered with wallpaper in geometric patterns, on top of which hung pictures in simple wooden frames. They were mostly oil-painted seascapes, although once Delia's eyes caught a portrait of a certain person in a white dress, who sat on a wooden chair and held on her knees a basket from which several flowers protruded. "Who is this?" The girl somewhat unceremoniously pointed at the portrait with her finger. Jaffet, who, having finished the front door, was about to go to the kitchen, in which Jussie Joe has already entered, lingered in the corridor and carefully examined the picture that his young guest had in mind. Then he looked down at Delia and adjusted his glasses. "Portrait of Elizabeth II from the hand of some Hungarian painter," he said. The girl couldn't believe her ears. Delia looked more closely at the portrait, but no matter how hard she tried, she did not notice in it any similarities with the English Queen. This, however, was not at all surprising. The portrait depicted a girl, God forbid, 8 years old, and therefore it would be strange if at such a young age she already looks like her in the present tense, 60-something years old at the time of the events. "Unfortunately, I can't remember the artist's name, but I don't think you're interested anyway," continued the owner of the apartment. Delia ignored this slightly haughty remark. She was much more interested in why this man living in America needed to hang a portrait of the Queen of Great Britain in his apartment. Is it really the matter that in this picture she was depicted at a young age? However, the girl thought, the owner could hang a picture of this kind just like that, without any special intention. Be that as it may, Delia's soul has already awakened the thirst for curiosity inherent in young children, mixed with the suspicion of a man eager to know how things really are. She looked inquiringly at Jaffet, but he, ignoring her, opened the drawer of a nearby secrétaire in portefeuille and took out a sum book. Delia moved closer to him and peered at the gilded letters on the white cloth cover. The title read Edward Coleman, Fables of My Father Swan. "What is that?" she asked, however, already guessing the contents of the book. The fact is that if the name of the author did not tell her anything, the name itself aroused her interest, since it clearly echoed the well-known collection of magic stories Tales of My Mother Goose, which Delia's mother used to read to her at night as a child. And although since then when she turned 8, at home never mentioned again about fairy tales, this did not prevent the girl from being in awe of them, even if she understands that the witchcraft described in them contradicts the material world and is hardly worthy of the attention of educated people. Meanwhile, Jaff looked at Delia and, taking the book under his arm, adjusted his glasses again, which kept sliding down to the tip of his aquiline nose. "I just thought, what if a child came to visit me," he began, "then I just have to offer him something interesting." "Do you like fairy tales?" Jaff asked kindly. "Who doesn't love them?" Delia responded enthusiastically. "Then you and I will definitely find a common language." There was genuine joy in voice of apartment's owner. "Hey Jaff, are you going to set the table?" A disgruntled and even authoritative shout reached their ears. These words of Ajasi Joe reawakened in the girl a little forgotten feeling of hunger, and Delia at the same moment rushed from the corridor to the kitchen, which, however, was somewhat reckless on her part, because the small space of Japheth's apartment was not conducive to such a method of transportation. Jordan was sitting in a chair, leaning back and impatiently fingered on the surface of the kitchen table, covered with a plain white enameled cloth. When he saw baby girl, he smiled reassuringly at her. "Sit down, Delia, let's see what Jaff will treat us to," he said lazily. At the same time, he nodded his head at a chair that stood by the window. "By the way, what to address you?" said the girl, taking her place at the table. Delia addressed this question to the owner of the apartment, who had already entered the kitchen. He placed the book of fairy tales on the edge of the countertop and, rolling up his sleeves, glanced at the curious guest. "Ajasi Jaff, just call me Ajasi Jaff," hesitating a bit, he replied. After these words, he went to the oven and, opening the glass door, took out an aluminum baking sheet, smoked from time, on which lay a large bundle of aluminum foil. Holding the dripping pan with both hands, apartment's owner carefully placed it on the table and, taking a knife, made a transverse cut on the mint and shiny surface, after which he laid out the lamb shoulder blade on the cutting board. "Burnt again, how can?" he sighed ruefully. Delia, swallowing her saliva, leaned across the table and stared at the appetizing surface of the meat. Indeed, the crust on the underside of the shoulder blade was slightly charred. "Nothing wrong," said the girl, sniffing the nice smell. "I love roast with crispy crust." "If you've been a lover of meat with blood, then you would be disappointed," Ajasi Jaff chuckled. He began to cut the lamb shoulder into small pieces, and Jordan made a sign to the girl. At first she did not understand what he meant, but following the movement of his right hand, guessed that he wanted her to get the plates. Delia got up and, shuffling her shoes, walked over to the countertop and pulled out the first drawer she found at random. It contained forks and spoons. "Do not delay, I need to put the meat," she heard impatient voice of Ajasi Jaff. Delia slammed the cutlery drawer shut and opened another, but there was not at all what she needed. Looking for some napkins and toothpicks, the girl understood how stupid she looked from the outside, but she couldn't help herself. "Well, leave this matter to me." Jordan got up from his chair. "And you sit down," he ordered Delia. The girl obediently followed her place, as Jordan walked over to the kitchen cabinets. He opened the doors of the top shelf and took out 3 white plates one by one, which he then placed in the sink. "I completely forgot that you can't reach that high," he said as he began rinsing them under running water. "Never mind," crossing her legs, the girl responded. After washing the plates, Ajasi Joe put them on the table and, closing the doors of kitchen cabinet, turned to apartment's owner. "Put the kettle, or do you want to?" he asked with a smile. "I made tea yet," growled Japhet, shifting the meat from the cutting board to the plates. "Don't fuss, you're bothering me." Ajasi Joe was once again sprawled out in his chair, crossing his legs like Delia, which made the girl smile. She was a little flattered that an adult man involuntarily repeats her movements after her. Baby girl suddenly caught herself thinking how much she liked his casual manner of carrying himself. At that moment, she even forgot about food, and only Japhet's voice brought her back to reality. "Dinner is served," said Japhet as he set out plates of meat in front of his guests. Delia, shaking her head, came to her senses and, moving the plate closer to her, picked up the fork, which Ajasi Jaff gave her in time. Ajasi Joe leaned back in his chair and followed suit as the apartment's owner placed a small teapot and 3 cups on the table. The girl with great appetite began to eat meat on both cheeks, despite the fact that apart from black pepper on the crust, there were no other spices in it, not even salt. "How does it taste?" asked Japhet, who finally took his seat at the table. Little girl, whose mouth was full of food, silently nodded her head, her dark eyes shone with pleasure. Jordan, in turn, putting another piece of meat into his mouth, inarticulately mumbled something in an affirmative tone. Apartment's owner, satisfied with the effect he had on his guests, filled the cups and ruffled his curly hair with his fingers. Maybe you want supplements? I have beans, if you remember, he suggested. Do not mix, mate, these foodstuff, Jordan responded. They need to be eaten with a break of at least an hour, otherwise the beans will kill the flavor of the meat. He spoke these words in a tone that left no doubt that Jussie Joe's knowledge of cooking was very superficial, but he, apparently, did not expect to convince anyone of his innocence, although Delia, who was already full by now, nodded her head in agreement. Then she looked at Japhet. I will eat beans later, but now I would love to read that book, and she pointed with her finger at the fairy tales volume lying on the countertop. Jussie Joe followed her movement and, grinning, took the cup in his hand. No, Jaff, he turned to the apartment's owner, what Delia means by read when she is read aloud. You got the hint, taking a sip, he winked at Jussie Jaff. Well, hesitated Japhet, obviously feeling awkward. My oratory skills are not great, but if the young lady wants, he looked at Delia, who was following their conversation with curiosity. Please, Jussie Jaff, read me a fairy tale, depicting on the face of charming helplessness, baby girl asked him. That's when you drink tea, then I will pamper you, answered Japhet. The instructive tone with which he spoke these words, girl didn't like. This minute Jussie Jaff behaved just like Delia's father, who has never distinguished himself by sophistication of manners, but he was very fond of emphasizing his superiority over others at every convenient opportunity. The little girl caught herself thinking that if usually children want to see the features of their parents in those around them, she was completely the opposite. She is disgusted when she sees familiar features in outsiders, as if her entire consciousness tried to abstract from everything that was connected with her relatives. Jussie Jaff, it's not tasty, Delia said petulantly. This remark was not without merit. Even when she was just going to visit, she heard Japhet's warning that he had no sweets at home, and drinking tea without sweets seemed to her a pointless exercise, for she always perceived tea as something to be washed down with, and not something to be drunk separately. God be with you, waving his hand, said Japhet. If you don't want tea, don't drink, I'm not forcing you to do that. Are we going to reading or not? Delia asked, already impatient to hear fairy tale. Let me drink, said Jaff, raising the cup to his lips. You don't mind, taking a sip of tea, he turned to Delia. The girl had no choice but to nod in agreement with apartment's owner, whereupon she crossed her legs and settled herself comfortably in a chair. So the three of them sat silently for 4 minutes, until finally Jordan got up from the table. All right, Jaff, stop chase the teas, without a twinge of conscience, he said. Then he started to leave the kitchen, beckoning the girl to follow him. Let's go to study, Delia, and take our seats, he said cheerfully, already standing in the corridor. Baby girl did not force herself to beg and got up from the table. She looked first at the book, then at Japhet. He continued to lackadaisically sip from the cup. Grab the book when you come to us, she said. Without waiting for his answer, Delia followed Jordan's lead and slipped out of the kitchen. Jussie Jaff followed her with his eyes, and then, leaving the cup, got up from his chair with a grunt. Delia went to Jussie Jaff's cabinet, in which there was the aroma of some unfamiliar to her essential oils. For a while she stood on the threshold, looking around the comfortably furnished room, the walls of which were covered with wallpaper of a pleasant aquamarine hue, and there was an Iranian carpet on the floor. At the other end of the cabinet, right by the window, was a large desk, where Delia realized Japhet worked. In addition, baby girl caught the eye of a large mahogany wardrobe, whose shelves were filled with various magazines and folders. Next to him, against the wall, was a cozy leather sofa, on which Jussie Joe was already sitting, cross-legged and throwing his hands behind his head. Seeing his young friend, he smiled at her and pointed to a chair that stood against the opposite wall. Settle in, Delia, he said optimistically. Now we'll listen to Jaff read aloud to us. Huzzah, enthusiastically responded Delia, plopping down in a chair upholstered in yellow chenille and immediately putting his hands on the armrests. Jussie Jaff entered the cabinet. Looking around the crowd, he jokingly shook his finger at Jordan and, nodding to Delia, sat down in a Grecian's chair in front of the desk. Crossing his legs, he cleared his throat and opened the book already known to all three on the very last page. As the girl understood, he wanted to check the content. "So, how to entertain our young lady," looking intently at the book, muttered Jaff. "Something so interesting, and better with morals," loud and clearly Delia spoke. "Well, good fairy tales without morals does not exist," as if by the way, noticed apartment's owner as he adjusted his glasses. "Depends how you look at it," Jordan threw somewhere to the side, but, meeting the girl's gaze, he immediately fell silent. "Oh. I found what we need," exclaimed Jussie Jaff and began to turn over the pages. "Here is an interesting story, written by Leonard Ostiner." "Wait," Delia raised her hand, "the author of the book is a certain Edward Coleman?" "You do not understand," Jaffet slightly scolded her, "he just compiled this compilation, and the creators of fairy tales are all different." "Well, I guess you know best," the girl trusted the authority of an adult. "So, Zelandine in 7th Avon," solemnly proclaimed Jussie Jaff. Crossing his legs, he clicked his tongue and began to read. 7th Avon is a magical town that was located on a celestial island hidden from mortals' eyes. It was possible to get there only by climbing the crystalline staircase, which appeared only in the deep night and only in one place, in one area at High Road. Last words Jaffet were pronounced with emphatic importance, which involuntarily made the girl laugh. "Yes, of course," she said, "what else can a town in skies be called, if not 7th Heaven?" "There may be a play on words here," Jussie Joe pointed out good-naturedly. "Only 6 inhabitants lived in this magical town," continued Jaffet. "It was Mason, who built houses, metalsmith, who forged all sorts of useful things, miner mined gems and gold, Montero hunted and fed everyone else, medic helped them with their health, and only one twiddler minstrel did nothing but useless versifying. And, of course, the town was ruled by a severe mayor." "Hold on," said Delia when Jussie Jaff caught his breath. "You said there were 6, and the mayor is not considered an inhabitant?" "Huh, 6 inhabitants in a town, to say nothing of the mayor," snapping his fingers, Jordan joked. "Well, like Jerome," apartment's owner agreed with him and continued. "All 7th Avon's inhabitants have one thing in common, each of them was over 2,000 years old, and they never appeared in front of people. But this does not mean that 7th Avenians did not know about the existence of mortals, on the contrary, those gems mined by miner, they were going to give it to people, but with one condition, when people stop making the warfares and killing their own kind. They'll do it when the pigs fly," Jussie Joe commented on the actions of the fabulous inhabitants. "For real, this whole story began in Ducal Chateau," continued Jussie Jaff. "It was inhabited by a young Marchioness Zelandine, which was called so because it is just a very beautiful name." "I do not agree with it," Delia responded. "What are you talking about?" Jaffet looked at her in surprise from under his glasses. "Every name must have a meaning," continued the girl. "For instance, my mother called me a Greek word, which means always visible." It was very curious to hear," Jussie Joe shook his head. "Delia," said apartment's owner after a pause, "you really must excuse me, but I think that thy mother swindled thee." The girl's eyes were bugging out, she didn't even know how to respond to this. Seeing her reaction, Jussie Jaff hastened to explain oneself. "I just know a thing or two about Helen culture," he began, "and I know that the name Delia means only born on the island of Delos." This explanation surprised baby girl, and she looked down at her shoes. "Incidentally," said Jaffet, "to one Greek goddess, specifically Artemis, your name was used just as an epithet." "Solidly, isn't it?" echoed him Jussie Joe, looking at the embarrassed Delia. "I sense how a wave of truth extinguished the fire of falsehood, without understanding why," Delia said softly. "You have a rich vocabulary," exclaimed Jordan, raising his finger to the ceiling. Apartment's owner didn't say anything, but the girl saw his eyes flash behind his glasses. She smiled involuntarily, she really liked the praise of her abilities, but after a moment her face again acquired a serious expression. "Okay, everything is clear with me," she said, leaning back in her chair, But after whom was the Marchioness from the fairy tale named then? Do you mean Zelandine? Asked a Jussie Jaff. Well, I don't even know. There is a herb with a very similar name, that's still weed. Jordan spoke thoughtfully. No, wait, I think I remembered something. Japhet called for attention. If I'm not mistaken, celandine itself was so named because it bloomed when the swallows returned, and withered after they flew away. I never looked before at that point in detail, said a Jussie Joe. Now adapt this into a fairy tale for our young lady. Good, apartment's owner agreed with him. Assume that Marchioness was named Zelandine, because her mother watched the swallows that flew near the walls of their chateau. That's quite another matter, happily exclaimed Delia. It already makes sense. You are intelligent girl, a Jussie Jaff praised her and continued to read. The young Marchioness lived in luxury and abundance, and in everyday life she was surrounded by theurgical creatures. For example, in the morning Zelandine woke up that sunny bunny, who descended from the window with the first rays of sunshine, rang his bell over her pillow. Delia couldn't help but laugh when she pictured this picture. A Jussie Joe laughed along with her, and only apartment's owner continued to sit silently in his chair, waiting for the listeners to calm down. When the fun calmed down, he again directed his eyes on the book. But not only the young Marchioness had her theurgical pet. The Duchess, her mother, had with her potted fairy, a tiny woman with wings who lived in a small pot and did not need food or drink, but could work miracles. However, the Duchess could easily do without her charms, for she herself was a sorceress, but this did not prevent her from tormenting little Beauty with the same question every day: how long will I to sit on the throne? Why did she ask her such a query? Delia asked. I think this should be understood as an allegory for the fact that Zelandine's mother was afraid of approaching old age, suggested a Jussie Jaff. But what about the obvious authority in the country? Jordan interrupted the conversation. Don't you understand what governance is, Joe? Japhet started arguing. The Duchess is not of the Queen, but rather the owner of several plots of land, on which she can dispose, but no more. Wait, so you mean to tell me that, a Jussie Joe was about to say, but the young listener interrupted him. All right, stop it, Delia exclaimed. I did not come to visit a Jussie Jaff in order to listen to such controversies. Well, from the mouths of Delia shall come the truth, Japhet agreed with her. So, Potted Fairy always answered her mistress the same, that the Duchess will reign happily ever after. Such an answer delighted the narcissistic woman. But she resorted not only to magic, almost all related to power were in charge by Chief Executor of Royal Wishes. Who was that? Surprised Delia. Never heard of post like this. Well, it's not hard to guess that this man fulfilled any desires of the insidious Duchess, Jordan noticed. But why is he exactly executor? Baby girl did not let up. This is just a play on words again, continued a Jussie Joe. He simultaneously executes both pleasant and violent requests. All right, Delia agreed with his words. Meanwhile Japhet smiled and went back to reading the story. Job title: Chief Executor of Royal Wishes at the court of the Duchess was established a long time ago. The person that will be discussed was a descendant in the third tribe. On his own, he was a great implementer. It was not difficult for him to sneak anywhere and quietly eavesdrop on the conspiracies of any interesting personalities who inspired fear in his proprietress. On that day, he ran into the throne room and reported that the army of the neighboring country was defeated, and their leader was captured. This good news pleased the Duchess so much that they immediately awarded him a medal for the pleasant news. And her daughter, Marchioness Zelandine, at that time communicated with two unusual inhabitants of Ducal Chateau. After reading this, a Jussie Jaff suddenly looked up from his book and looked at Delia. The girl noticed how on his face flashed an expression of slight mockery, which quickly disappeared, replaced by sheer seriousness. I want you to guess for yourself who the Marchioness was talking to, Japhet said with a touch of irony. Noticing how the girl's face turned bright red, he smiled and winked at her reassuringly. I'll give you a hint, their names started with the letter C. As if doing a favor, he continued. CNC, he immediately joked. Delia began to go over in her mind all the palace titles she knew in the hope that at least one of them will be suitable. It was not very easy, because since childhood she did not like all this monarchist nonsense, and only clichés from pretentious films and boring soap operas on historical topics came to mind. After a minute, she was able to find the right words and, sighing, looked up at apartment's owner. Chancellor and Counselor, she blurted out with some relief. It was a good try, Ajussi Jaff said with a grin, but not, Zelandine was not talking to people. This revelation took the girl by surprise. It seemed as if she had completely forgotten that they were reading a fairy tale to her, and not documentary chronicles from the life of some political person. With whom, maybe animals, she asked, wrinkling her brow. No, cryptically said Japhet, with vegetables. And, without letting the girl come to her senses, apartment's owner returned to reading the fairy tale. Cactus and Chamomile, who grew up in the parlor, had the ability to speak like humans. When Zelandine had nothing to do, she sat down on a chair in front of the window and listened, how her green friends tell her about what has been and what will be in the world. That day they told Marchioness that today she is 18 years old, and on this occasion, they want to please her with the news that she will meet her fiancé, who, as was customary in those distant times, should give her a heart pierced by an arrow. When Zelandine, delighted by this news, immediately went to the palace hall, Cactus and Chamomile began to whisper among themselves about who the mysterious chosen one of Marchioness would look like. I think it's definitely not a prickly peyote, Delia interrupted him with a laugh. Japhet took a breath and, with a satisfied smile, looked at his young listener, continued. Some will wonder why the Marchioness was so pleased with the news of her birthday. It's simple, the mother tried her best to keep her daughter in the dark about her age, because she was afraid that when the girl turned 18, she would not refuse the opportunity to take her place on the throne. Of course, Zelandine never even thought of that. All she wanted that day was on the occasion of her birthday throw a merrymaking. Approaching the palace hall, on the way she already imagined how hundreds of candles were lit in it, and hundreds of guests entered, with the arrival of which began the bona fide ball. The Marchioness saw with her own eyes the graceful cavaliers, who, sparkling in their eyes and clinking their spurs, danced with elegant ladies, and at the very end of the hall she saw the silhouette of a beautiful young man, to whom she wanted to throw herself into the arms. Japhet's reading was interrupted by a muffled yawn. It was Jordan shifting on leather sofa, bringing a hand up to his face to cover his mouth. It sounded boring, Delia admitted honestly, also covering her mouth with her palm. Just be patient, said Ajussi Jaff. In each fairy tale there are few interesting descriptions of secular life. Okay, answered the girl, wiping her hand on the arm of her chair. But alas, continued Japhet, in fact, there was a copper cauldron in the palace hall, into which the Marchioness's mother threw milkweed leaves, snake fangs and wasp stings. The poisonous brew foamed and seethed, and the sorceress herself furiously whispered over it the words of some spells. When the water finally flooded the coals that lay under the cauldron, the Duchess began to interrogate the prisoner in the chain, youthful Sagamore, whom, by her silent decree, the guards brought. She wanted to ask the captive, where hide old men, women and children of broken, but not conquered country. But youthful Sagamore, even under penalty of death, did not tell her anything. Ajussi Jaff uttered the last words with such enthusiasm, as if he was personally present at this interrogation and wholeheartedly sympathized with that young man who had lost his homeland and freedom. His young listener could not resist commenting. "Hear brave, daring heart," Delia exclaimed loudly and jumped on the spot, causing her black hair to fall picturesquely over her shoulders. Both of her adult interlocutors stared at her with some bewilderment, as if trying to understand the reason for her unbridled joy. Jordan even stroked his frizzy hair with his palm, making it look even worse. From his face, the girl realized that he envied her young ardor in his soul, but because of the presence of his close friend tries not to express his feelings in any way. Japhet himself, having looked at the guest from head to toe, only grinned meaningfully and returned to the book, which he continued to hold in his hands. When the Duchess understood what youthful Sagamore does not agree to commit treason to his motherland? She called the guards behind her and, leaving the prisoner alone, went to give instructions to the slaughterers. Just at that moment, Zelandine reached the palace hall, and what was the surprise of the Marchioness when she caught sight of a handsome, but exhausted and chained young man. She immediately rushed to youthful Sagamore and started asking questions, to which he willingly answered, because he felt a kindred spirit in the girl. Hearing his sad story, the heart of the young Marchioness was filled with readiness to regain freedom to youthful Sagamore. But what could her fragile hands do? I wonder what ideology adhered Leonard Austener, who wrote this fairy tale, thoughtfully said Adjussie Joe. What are you even talking about, not understanding the friend's words? Asked Japhet. Just think about this, mate, with the air of a connoisseur began Jordan. This author has a representative of the feudal class became sympathetic to the leader of the oppressed people. Don't you find that this is some kind of prerequisite for mutiny, a overturn? Will you please stop? Delia interrupted his ranting about politics. I agree with you, Adjussie Jaff supported the girl and continued reading. But at this time in the palace hall came back the Zelandine's mother, who, having found her daughter next to the prisoner, immediately ordered to send youthful Sagamore to the dungeon, and she herself attacked the Marchioness with loud reproaching cries. When the Duchess realized that objurgations would not help the cause, she gave Zelandine a pearl-encrusted diadem. In this sparkling attire, the young Marchioness seemed so beautiful to everyone, that after her departure, the alarmed woman immediately rushed to her chambers, that asked the potted fairy. Answer of little beauty scared her in earnest. According to her forecasts, Zelandine was supposed to throw the Duchess off the throne any minute. Listening to the fairy tale, Delia imperceptibly let out a deep sigh. Adjussie Jaff looked up from his book and looked at her with a smile. The girl blushed slightly and lowered her eyes. I just thought the Duchess was a bit like my mommy, she spoke softly. Interesting, what exactly? Jordan couldn't resist asking. To tell the truth, little girl began, Mother also has the same mood swings, then it seems to her that everything is against her, and the next second she is imbued with a great love for the world. How many years your mom? Urgently asked Japhet. I don't know the exact age, intervened Adjussie Joe, but she is younger than her 50-year-old husband by about 20 years. So, 30-something, said Adjussie Jaff, not in the least surprised at such a difference in the ages of the spouses. Midlife crisis, what to take from her? Both grown men looked at Delia. Baby girl was sitting in a chair, staring at the floor. She had, of course, overheard their conversation about her mother, but she didn't care what it was about. Little girl just wanted to hear the continuation of the tale. Japhet exchanged glances with his friend, shrugged and returned to his book. As soon as the Duchess heard Potted Fairy's prediction, how her soul was immediately filled with hatred and envy for her own daughter, and she decided to take revenge on the young Marchioness. She went through many ways of revenge in her head, and in the end decided sell Zelandine into slavery to some sea-wolf, who then plowed the sea on their huge schooners. The Duchess immediately called for Aldjaeger, over which she constantly abusing, and ordered him to carry out her order. Aldjaeger did not dare to disobey his proprietress and took Zelandine behind the walls of ducal chateau. Passing through the gate, he was about to head to the harbor, where the trading schooners were anchored, but fortunately for the Marchioness, they got in the way of Clever Crow, who prompted Aldjaeger that he can just leave the girl on the high road, but himself return to the Duchess and report her that the girl was killed on the way by marauders. Aldjaeger, who was tormented by sympathy for Zelandine, immediately followed the wise advice of the bird and turned back to ducal chateau, and Lever Crow in turn hid in the branches of an ancient oak that grew by the pathway. Unhappily, the Duchess at the first words of Aldjaeger understood that she was deceived, and, without listening to his story to the end, ordered her guards to seize Aldjaeger and take into courtyard to trophy guillotine, the very one that her soldiers got in the war with the people of youthful Sagamore. For some reason, a story about how an unlucky old man got caught in his lies made Delia so excited that she immediately burst into carefree laughter. Both of her interlocutors looked at each other, as if they were very embarrassed. When the girl calmed down a little, she smiled guiltily at them and straightened her dress. "He shouldn't have listened other animals' advice," Delia said smartly. "In your words contains a kernel of truth," began Jordan, "but, in my opinion, it is indecent to laugh at death." "So old Jaeger is fabled," rightly noticed girl. "What's wrong with laughing at the death of a fictional character?" But the silent reproach that was read in the eyes of Jussie Joe and Jussie Jaff forced her to bite her tongue and shrink into a chair. Fortunately, the silence did not last long. Soon Japhet continued reading. Zelandine was left alone on the high road. It was night outside, and the young Marchioness became frightened and frightened. Afraid of the dark, she began to call her voice to the night skies, and soon to her desperate cries from the darkness arrived Clever Crow, which already familiar to us. Seeing Zelandine, he ordered her to follow a swarm of kind-hearted fireflies glowing in the gloom. Young Marchioness followed his advice, and finally the insects led her to the crystalline staircase that led straight to heaven. Zelandine climbed it and ended up in an amazing place, where, among countless clouds, an island soared, on which, among flowers and trees, there were small, but very lovely lodges, with red-tiled roofs and white round walls. When the young Marchioness came closer to the settlement, a nimble and agile little man ran out to meet her. In one hand was a lute, and in the other a sheet of paper covered with ink. "It was minstrel," exclaimed the girl, remembering the beginning of fairy tale. "Well, who else would it be?" Jussie Jaff asked a rhetorical question. And, as you already guessed, the Marchioness ended up in Seventh Haven, same magical town. "All right, it's so obvious," with a slight annoyance in her voice, Delia gives an holy glare. At the same time, she was not at all surprised when Jussie Joe, scratching his knee, grunted mysteriously. Who knows, maybe he heard this fairy tale not for the first time, maybe even knew it by heart. Be that as it may, the girl's attention turned again to Japhet, who at that moment, slapping his forehead, buried himself in the book again. As soon as the little man saw the Marchioness, he began to sing loudly and play the lute, and soon to the sound of his music from lodges started coming out other inhabitants of the heavenly town. As soon as they gathered in full force on the street, the oldest-looking little man approached Zelandine and began to interrogate her. Who is she and how did she end up in their magical town? Young Marchioness did not lie and answered honestly that this day she turned 18 years old, and that her mother kicked her out of the home, not even allowing to celebrate this wonderful red-letter day. The inhabitants of the heavenly city were imbued with sympathy for Zelandine and decided to let her stay with them. Mayor immediately gave the order to build a dwelling for the Marchioness, which Mason managed in just 10 minutes. Because he was always ready all necessary tools and materials. When Jussie Jaff paused to catch his breath, Jordan, who all this time concentratedly examined the lying at his feet Iranian carpet with elaborate pattern, suddenly raised his eyes to apartment's owner. Displeasure was read in Jussie Joe's eyes, as if he could not believe that his friend had uttered such stupid and unexpected words for him. "It's kind of unrealistic, isn't it?" he grunted under his breath. He shook his head sadly. Delia, who listened eagerly to every word Jussie Jaff said, "Don't waste time asking Jordan exactly what he meant, that the Marchioness was so easily allowed to live in Seventh Haven, or how quickly they built a lodge for her." However, to leave his remark unanswered would be tactlessness on her part. It was not enough for him to consider her in some simpleton. So Delia, after taking a second to think, straightened her shoulders and rose slightly in her chair, so as to attract the eyes of all those present. "Jussie Joe, you forgot it was a fairy tale," she exclaimed loudly throughout the cabinet. "It doesn't have to be realistic. Truth is on your side." Apartment's owner himself agreed with her and continued reading. Inhabitant of Seventh Haven never regretted that the young Marchioness settled in their town, for good Zelandine paid good. She constantly took care of everyone and baked delicious pies for all her new friends, what they liked very much, for up to this point they had lived on the simple baked meat of animals that Montero had hunted. Besides Twiddler Minstrel, who happened to see the Marchioness before others, composed about her a very tender ballad, in which he praised her beauty and kindness, and also did not fail to blame her mother for how unfairly she treated her daughter. When he read this ballad to the Marchioness herself, heart of Zelandine filled with a warm feeling for Minstrel, but she did not reciprocate him, for she thought of the youthful Sagamore, whom she supposed was still languishing in captivity with the Duchess. By the way, for a long time we have not heard something about what happened in Ducal Chateau, Delia couldn't resist commenting. You're about to find out, Adjussi Jaff smiled and continued. Marchioness Mother was not satisfied, how old Jaeger disposed of her daughter's life, butchering him on the guillotine. The woman, without wasting a minute, decided to dress like a beggar maid and make one's way through Seventh Avon. Why did she invite Chief Executor of Royal Wishes? The point was that since the Duchess lived all her life in splendor, she was completely unaware to ask for alms. Chief Executor of Royal Wishes spent 2 whole days with her, a couple of exercises, but the Duchess was a very bad schooldame. She constantly broke into a secular tone, which was totally unacceptable to play the role of a beggar maid. Realizing that it will not lead to anything good, her teacher decided to take up the matter himself. Chief Executor of Royal Wishes turned to Potted Fairy and asked her to turn him into a pauper. The effect exceeded all expectations. Young man, at the behest of a little beauty, transformed into an elderly man dressed in dirty rags. One of his eyes was hidden behind a black bandage, and both legs were so crooked that without a crutch he was completely helpless. From now on, no one could doubt that it's not Subdolus, Chief Executor of Royal Wishes, but just an elder and diseased cripple who needs an attitude adjustment. Hearing these words, Delia burst into laughter. It seemed painfully comical to her, the appearance of a aching gaffer, into which Chief Executor of Royal Wishes turned. She couldn't understand why he had to disfigure himself like that, but already the fact that now his appearance fully corresponded to his disgustful soul gave her a sense of satisfaction. Adjussi Joe and Adjussi Jaff didn't frown at her this time. Obviously they, too, agreed with how the fairy from the fairy tale dealt with the guileful executioner. At any rate, Delia could clearly hear soft but approving chuckle of Jordan. When the girl finally calmed down, she tilted her head up and scratched the back of her head. You can keep reading, she tossed at Jaffet, wiping her tears from laughter. All right, nodded apartment's owner. At the end of Servant's Metamorphosis, the Duchess handed the cripple a phial of poison, 1 drop of which was enough to send Zelandine to the land of eternal dreams. Bowing to his proprietress, Chief Executor of Royal Wishes went out the gate of Ducal Chateau and, waiting for the night, climbed the crystalline staircase into Seventh Avon, where, having found the lodge of the young Marchioness, he splashed poison on her and immediately rushed to run. However, he made a mistake in his calculations. Encouraged throwing a phial on the floor. The sound of breaking glass immediately woke up all 6 inhabitants of the town, who, led by Mayor, rushed in pursuit of the cripple, whose crooked legs have done him a disservice. Unable to break away from the persecution, Chief Executor of Royal Wishes lost his crutch and was forced to stop halfway to the descent into ground. And then he had a bad time, very bad. Worse than ever. So, what happened to this vile villain? Delia asked without taking her eyes off the narrator. I think that Seventh Avon's inhabitants just threw him down the stairs, Jordan suggested. Delia couldn't help but admit that Adjussi Joe's answer was convincing enough, but she still felt a little offended. What Leonard Ostiner, the author of this fairy tale, did not mention, how did the heroes committed a massacre with the misdoer? However, it could be understood. After all, he wrote a children's story, and surely Mr. Ostiner had to try to make his work look as innocent as possible, avoiding any reference of violence, not to scare its immature audience. But in the depths of Delia's soul lived an unconscious disgust for all sorts of miscreants, because of which she was not satisfied with such a superficial description of what happened to Chief Executor of Royal Wishes. Jaffet continued. When the cripple was finished, the inhabitants of Seventh Avon returned to the lodge, where the poor Marchioness lay motionless in bed. The poison that Chief Executor of Royal Wishes splashed on Zelandine's face plunged the girl into such a deep sleep that she could not be awakened by any forces. Seventh Avenians were gripped by immense grief, and even severe and incredulous Mayor sobbed inconsolably, kneeling by the bed on which lay the lifeless body of the young Marchioness. However, soon in Seventh Avon our old friend Clever Crow flew in, who explained to the saddened residents how to save the girl. All that was needed for this was to bring a youthful Sagamore into the magical town, who still languished in the dungeon of the Duchess, because they are with Zelandine love each other. This sounds like a tired mantra, muttered Jordan, turning his eyes to the ceiling. Awakening a girl from sleep by kissing? Certainly not, a Jussie joke, Delia retorted enthusiastically. It's so romantic. I guess in fairness, coughing, Japhet remarked, in the tale there is not a one word about what exactly was supposed to awaken the Marchioness. Maybe a kiss, or maybe something completely different. Delia gave a Jussie Jaff a radiant smile with holy glare and nodded in agreement. For the first time in all the time they spent together, face of apartment's owner suddenly flushed with embarrassment. It seemed to baby girl that it was difficult to embarrass Japhet, but she was wrong. After wiping the sweat off his neck, he turned away from the young guest for a second and looked at the chandelier hanging from the ceiling. After a while, he looked at the girl and, seeing a mischievous smile on her face, good-naturedly shook head at her and turned back to his book. Seventh Avenians gathered a council at which they began to decide which of them should go to rescue the prisoner from dungeon. After several discussions and debates, they came to the conclusion that it should be done by the youngest of all those present, namely, Twiddler Minstrel. In less than an hour he had already descended the stairs to the high road, and, stealthily sneaking into Ducal Chateau, slipped into the Duchess's bedchamber, where she kept the magic pot. Taking it in hand, Minstrel appealed to its tiny dweller to free the youthful Sagamore. Potted Fairy did not agree to this proposal, and meanwhile the guards heard a noise from the bedchamber. Hearing their stomp, Minstrel fell into a panic and not knowing what to do next, decided to take the most extreme step. He asked the little beauty, so that she scattered palatial walls, to which Potted Fairy agreed without further ado. And when 4 warriors had already broken through the doors and seized Minstrel, the building suddenly shook and the heavy ceiling collapsed down, burying everyone who at that time was in the ducal chateau. Really, is Minstrel too? Delia exclaimed in fright. Yes, him and Potted Fairy died both, with deadly seriousness, Japhet replied. Don't you cry, he consoled the girl, noticing large transparent drops in her eyes. He managed to produce the desired effect on Delia. She immediately wiped away her tears and sniffled, why her black curls are finally disheveled. Besides, her dress, once so neat, now looked worn and wrinkled. The girl, noticing the gaze of men on herself, hurriedly got herself in order, neatly smoothed her skirt on her knees and for the umpteenth time that evening straightened her hair. When Delia looked back at Japhet, he silently nodded to her, as if letting him know that he was satisfied with her appearance and continued his interrupted occupation, that is, he began to read a fairy tale aloud and expressively. Don't forget to turn the pages so you don't miss a single line. Little girl, holding her breath, listened to his pleasant baritone. Of all the ducal chateau's indwellers only one person survived, as it is easy to guess, it was youthful Sagamore, who, taking advantage of the general commotion, got out of his cell a moment before the walls of the dungeon collapsed. After wandering around the wreckage for a while, he got out into the regal garden, where at this time among the crowns of fruit trees and neatly trimmed bushes just taking a break from the day's worries already familiar to us Lever Crow. Noticing the survivor, Bird immediately flew up from the tree and, slowly circling over his head, told youthful Sagamore about what happened with Zelandine, and then ordered him to wait until nightfall to climb the crystalline staircase to heaven. Having finished his narrative, Clever Crow flapped his wings and soared into the air, leaving youthful Sagamore alone in the regal garden. After reading this, Japhet looked up from the book and exchanged significant glances with his young listener, whose face, in the soft incandescent light, seemed unusually serious for an 8-year-old child. Delia bit her lip in confusion and ran her finger along the upholstery of the chair in which she sat. A Jussie Jaff, what happened next? After a minute of silence she asked. Our fairy tale has reached its end, apartment's owner said as he moved to slam the book shut. Listen, no, hold on, the girl begged, getting up from her seat. Without further ado, Japhet obediently handed the book into the hands of Delia, who approached him, which the next second opened it on a bookmarked page and, wrinkling her brow, began to carefully examine its contents. The last line was exactly what Ajasi Jaff had read out loud to her, followed by a completely different story called Molly and the Pretty Parents, authored by a certain Machiel Naimu. Realizing that the fairy tale really ended at this point, Delia slammed the book shut with a sigh and looked up at Japhet with her large eyes, in which silent sadness froze. The man had no choice but to silently nod his head, as if confirming the correctness of her conclusions. "So, did you enjoy this fairy tale?" Jordan asked the girl, rising from the leather sofa. Delia continued to stand thoughtfully with a book in her hands. From the outside it seemed that she was not entirely sure how much she liked the story that apartment's owner read to her. Listening to her own feelings, she looked around the room several times, trying not to linger on her interlocutors. Finally, Delia made up her mind and nodded her head affirmatively. "Yeah, that delighted me," baby girl said with some embarrassment. "I expected it to end in a corny way, but..." "What do you mean by corny way?" Japhet, who had previously continued to sit on his chair with a detached face, suddenly perked up. Well, Delia was confused, starting to blush. If the youthful Sagamore found the Marchioness and kissed her, and they were happy, then it would be quite flatly, although romantic. She stopped mid-sentence. It seemed that she was having a hard time finding words that could adequately convey her impression of the fairy tale. Jordan, who was already stretching his legs, numb from sitting on the sofa for a long time, quietly cleared his throat and raised his hand up, perhaps in order to distract the girl from a topic that was too difficult for a child. Delia noticed his gesture and immediately calmed down. "Jaff," Ajasi Joe turned to his close friend, "it's already difficult for Delia to describe her feelings, and you're pestering her with your questions. That won't do, mate." Japhet moved towards the exit of the cabinet, and, having caught up with Jordan, patted him on the shoulder in a friendly manner. Delia noticed a grimace of slight annoyance on his face and thought that Ajasi Joe's words clearly struck a nerve with Ajasi Jaff, but he tried his best to make a favorable impression on his young guest and therefore tried not to show his displeasure. "Let's go and eat something, there's still time," voice of apartment's owner came from the corridor. Joe and Delia left the cabinet and followed him. Pausing for a second near the door leading to the kitchen, baby girl inhaled the pleasant smell of baked beans that Japhet had just heated in the microwave oven. Walking to kitchen in after Ajasi Joe, she immediately took the place at the table, which she had chosen since her arrival here, right opposite the exit, so that at any moment she can quickly sneak back, if any unforeseen circumstances arise, which Delia, however, was not at all sure about. "Enjoy your meal," said Japhet as he placed 2 plates on the table, one for Ajasi Joe and one for Delia. The owner of the apartment himself began to making tea. Placing an electric kettle under the tap, he filled it with tap water and then connected it to the electrical network, after which he sat down at the table and, pulling out a small notebook from the pocket of his wide pants, he opened it and, casting a thoughtful glance at the girl, began to quickly write something down. Delia, busy eating, didn't pay attention to it for a while, but when Japhet put the rollerball pen on the edge of the table to unplug the kettle, baby girl looked up at him and put her fork down. "What are you writing there, Ajasi Jaff?" she asked, continuing to chew the beans. Japhet turned around and looked at her carefully, holding a kettle in his hands, from which came a thick white stream of hot steam. He was silent for some time and then, pouring boiling water into a small earthenware teapot standing on the table, he put the electric kettle back in place. "So, memos for my hobby," Ajasi Jaff answered the girl with dignity, taking his place at the table. Delia immediately reached for the stationery lying in front of the man to verify the veracity of his words. Ajasi Jaff did not interfere with her, and after a few seconds the girl was already holding in her hands a small notebook in a simple leather binding, the pages of which were covered with small, but quite legible handwriting. Delia quickly ran her eyes over the first page she came across, but not understanding where the most recent entry was, she raised her eyes to Ajasi Jaff, who, meeting her concentrated gaze, nodded to her, as if approving her curiosity. "Open it up to page 91 and read," said helpfully apartment's owner, clearly not intending to hide anything from his young guest. Baby girl followed his advice and began nervously flipping through the thin pages until she finally found the last entry, which made her raise her eyebrows in amazement. On the practically empty page there was only one line written in a sweeping manner, which read, "The waves of truth tends to extinguish fire of the falsehood." "Hey, this is my own words," little girl whispered in shock. "I said them when you were reading me a fairy tale." She stared at Japhet in bewilderment, but he simply took the notebook from her and, putting it in his pocket, shrugged. "This is for my research regarding American citizens having Greek names," he answered with a smile. Delia shook her head in disbelief. Such an explanation for a Jussie Jaffe's inexplicable deed was too implausible for her to believe him. Meanwhile, Jordan finished the beans and, leaving the empty plate aside, poured some black tea into his cup. "It's a pity, of course, that you don't have sweets at home," he said, raising the cup to his lips, "but since we are not here to praise your culinary talents, let's come to the point." With these words, he put the cup on the table and fixed a concentrated gaze on Delia, which spoke of how important a subject he was going to discuss with her. Baby girl could not suppress her astonishment. She had never seen him so serious before, but the next second she came to her senses and even smiled. "Listen to me, Delia," began a Jussie Joe, looking carefully into her eyes. "When you and I go home, don't even think about talking to anyone about what happened. Do you understand?" "Unfortunately not," the girl admitted honestly, batting her eyes. "What are you on about?" she asked her interlocutor. "Fairy tale, about fairy tale," he answered in a conspiratorial tone. "Don't tell your parents that you listened to it while visiting." "I don't see what's wrong with that." Delia still didn't understand what a Jussie Joe was getting at. "You don't have to do this," evasively but firmly said Jordan. "I don't want them to think that you heard some baloney from a Jussie Jaff." "Well, a Jussie Joe," baby girl said capriciously. "You told me the same thing when you read me that book in German." She paused, remembering its name. Yes, about Lord God in the flesh," Jordan nodded, smiling at his interlocutor. "There was a reason there too, but it's not relevant. Now you have to remember, act as if nothing happened, is that clear?" "Okay," Delia answered obediently, looking hopefully at apartment's owner, who was silently listening to their conversation. "Do you promise to hold your tongue?" continued a Jussie Joe. "I make a promise I won't tell anyone," she answered with emphasized seriousness and nodded. "You're a very intelligent girl." Jordan immediately relaxed, taking a sip from his cup. Delia, without touching her tea, got up from the table and, stretching out to her full short height, went to the entrance door. A Jussie Joe, giving the apartment's owner a significant nod, followed her example. Jordan helped the baby girl out of the apartment and, lingering on the landing, wanted to close the door behind him, but Japhet was already standing at the threshold. "Best of luck out there," he shouted after his guests and slammed the door behind them. Joe and Delia went out into the street, where dusk was already gathering, and without hesitating for a minute, they walked quickly towards their homes. After all, Delia's parents were waiting at home, whom she completely forgot to warn about her unplanned visit to her neighbor's close friend. On the way, the girl thought about why a Jussie Joe strictly forbade her to tell mom and dad about the fairy tale she listened to at a party. Is all this really due to the fact that, she thought, that instead of the traditional for fairy tales plot prince and princess in Zelandine and Seventh Avon there was a young Sagamore who was the enemy of the mother of his beloved Marchioness? Or is it because Leonard Ostiner, Tales author, described as many as 3 deaths, at first the guillotining of Ald Jaeger, then falling of chief executor of royal wishes from Heavenly Island and at the very end, destruction of ducal chateau? This is unlikely, little girl decided, quickly walking along the sidewalk after her adult companion, who seemed to have completely forgotten about her existence. In any case, Jordan hardly looked back at Delia, only sometimes slowing down, when they occasionally met mothers, carrying strollers with their very tiny kids.